Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual program at the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library based in Medora, North Dakota. My name is Alice Wind. I am the Digital History and Engagement Associate here. And the library will be opening July 4th of this year, 2026. And I mention that because tickets just went on sale to the general public today. So if you're interested, head to trlibrary.com to purchase. And tonight's program, we are featuring our speaker, Bill Bleyer, who will be discussing one of TR's lesser-known influences, who is his uncle, Robert B. Roosevelt. While I introduce our guest speaker, I encourage you to drop the name of your favorite Roosevelt family member in the chat, TR excluded, so not the 26th president of the United States. Who is your favorite Roosevelt? Okay, so now to our guest. So Bill Bleyer is a prize-winning former Newsday staff writer who spent more than 3 decades covering history and maritime topics. He is the author of 7 books, including The Roosevelts in New York City and Sagamore Hill, Theodore Roosevelt's Summer White House. His work has appeared in publications like Smithsonian and American Heritage, and he's been featured on C-SPAN. He has also taught journalism and maritime history at Hofstra University and Webb Institute. Before I turn it over to Bill for the presentation, I wanted to remind you that there will be a short Q&A after the lecture. Feel free to send your questions in at any time, and we will address them after the lecture concludes. All right, so without further ado, I will, let's see. And I will remove myself, and Bill, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Alice. Thanks everybody around the country and Long Island for tuning in. So it's hard to imagine anyone more interesting than Theodore Roosevelt, particularly or especially out of his own family. But in some ways, TR's uncle Robert Barnwell Roosevelt outshone the 26th president, and not in ways that most of his relatives appreciated. And that's why most people haven't heard of him, because he was considered the black sheep of this famous family up until last decade or so, when people began to embrace his unusual style. I got involved when I was told about him by the head of the Theodore Roosevelt Association back in 1985, and did this magazine cover story about him. And I had never heard of him either at that point. But with his full beard, piercing blue-gray eyes and stern, intelligent countenance, RBR, as he was known in the family, resembled his younger brother, Theodore Sr., who lived next door on East 20th Street in Manhattan. But their personalities differed pretty widely. Here's Robert on the left there, and Theodore, the youngest of the 5 sons, on the right. Robert's born on August 7th, 1829, 2 years before Theodore Sr., and he had no middle name. Theodore Sr. had no middle name, but Robert's was Barnhill, which was the maiden name of his mother, Margaret, who you see here. It's not the greatest image, but that's the best we have. But she was a Quaker from Philadelphia, and she broke the mold of the Roosevelts up until that time, who had always married within the Dutch immigrant community. The problem for Robert was he gets into politics. He was worried about having a middle name of Barnhill, so he changed it to Barnwell, because he thought his political opponents might compare him to a pile of dung. So by all accounts, he was a brilliant man with an ever-present sense of humor. His grandnephew, Nicholas Roosevelt, who was a conservationist, author, and diplomat in his own right, wrote in his 1953 memoir that, quote, Rob loved laughter and to make people laugh and had fun in public life, and close quote. And much like his nephew Theodore, he had an incredibly wide range of interest. These included conservation and crusading against corrupt politicians. So you can make a pretty convincing case that he influenced his nephew in following those same pursuits. And we know as an adult that TR often referred to books written by his uncle. So here's RBR in middle age. He had a wide-ranging career just like Theodore. He was a lawyer who practiced from 1850 until 1871. In that year, he was elected to the House of Representatives and then continued his law practice after leaving office. He was a very successful lawyer, which is documented in a scrapbook that he kept of news clippings about the cases that he handled. He was also a crusading newspaper editor, member of the New York City Board of Aldermen in 1882, treasurer of the Democratic National Committee in 1892, American minister to the Netherlands in 1888 to 1890, and the author of 8 books, most of them about fish and game, birds, and conservation. He was a pioneering environmentalist, and he spurred the creation of New York State's fish and conservation and management system that established hatcheries around the state to replenish depleted populations of fish. He served as president of the Holland Trust Company and was vice president or director of other financial and insurance companies. He was an accomplished yachtsman, and he helped found and lead many clubs. The most interesting of them was the Potluck Club, which he created and was elected permanent president. And what they did is the members, male and female, would cook exotic dishes and then write songs or parodies about what they had contributed and then enjoy the food. He was president of the Holland Society. He even wrote a play when he was only 17, which was almost produced, but then the producer went bankrupt and the show was not mounted. And then nobody else could mount it because the manuscript was destroyed in a fire at the Winter Garden Theater where he had left it. During the Civil War, Robert, like his brother Theodore Sr., did not join the army, but he joined the state militia unit to defend New York in case the Confederates ever attacked. And he actively supported the Union, as his brother did, helping to form various organizations, including the Loyal National League, the Union League Club, which helped create volunteer regiments, and the Allotment Commission, which was started with his brother to get soldiers to be able to send their pay home to their families directly through the government rather than on their own through the mails. But Robert and his more distant Hyde Park relatives remained Democrats throughout the war, even though he supported Lincoln and the Union. But Theodore Sr. And other Oyster Bay branch Roosevelts changed their party affiliation to Republican to support Lincoln, and they never switched back. So that divided the family politically and geographically. So we have the Oyster Bay Republican Roosevelts from then on, and the Democratic Hyde Park Roosevelts from then on. So he had obviously very varied accomplishments. He loved to enjoy entertaining. He enjoyed entertaining avant-garde guests, including Oscar Wilde at his home. But he was little known after his death. And the reasons were that he was overshadowed by his nephew's political career and the fact that he was considered an embarrassment to his family. So they almost never talked about him. Part of his problem was, at the time, running for office was considered unseemly in his elite social circle. But it was his extramarital affairs, particularly having a separate family with a mistress for whom he set up a separate household down the street, that so scandalized the Roosevelts that they rarely discussed him ever at all. On top of that, his first wife, Elizabeth Ellis Roosevelt, whom he married in 1850, was also unconventional, but in a far different way. Aunt Lizzie Ellis, as she was called in the family by her nieces and nephews next door, to distinguish her from another Aunt Lizzie in the family, was described as unorthodox by relatives. And the reason is, among other things, at the rear of the third floor of their brownstone on East 20th Street, she kept a menagerie of guinea pigs, chickens, pigeons, a parrot, and even a monkey named Topsy. The monkey liked to bite other people, but got along with Aunt Lizzie, and she dressed it like a fashionable child in ruffled shirts with gold studs. But at one point, Lizzie went too far. She brought a cow through the house into the backyard to provide milk for the family, and the the neighbors in the surrounding houses complained. And when she wouldn't remove it, they threatened legal action. So the cow was finally removed, but when they're taking it back through the house, it panicked. So they had to blindfold and hog tie the cow and drag it back out onto East 20th Street. So Daniel Prebutt, who is the now retired National Park Service Museum curator for Manhattan sites, told me that, quote, "I truly believe that Robert had a lot to do with Theodore's interest in animals because Theodore's mother, Mittie, was very particular about the cleanliness of the house. So there were no pets there. Although later Theodore had his taxidermy prizes, the family never had a pet, which is unusual for someone like Theodore not to have animals around. But he got around that because his wife, thanks to his uncle, because his wife Elizabeth was eccentric and liked to keep animals. So Lizzie eventually became an invalid who spent most of her time in her bedroom. And then Robert went out and sought comfort with other women, many other women. It was his shocking lack of morality as far as the family was concerned that caused the other Roosevelts, particularly his brother next door, to try to forget him. Theodore Roosevelt biographer David McCullough, who was one of the first historians to write about Robert in any depth, described him as being, quote, "a bit lax in his morals. He was what polite society referred to as a bohemian, the kind of man who kept company with actresses and such." So he was a sharp contrast to his maritally faithful and morally strict younger brother, Theodore Sr., and his nephew, Theodore. He was known to have affairs with many women around Manhattan, and the family handed down a story that he would go to A.T. Stewart's department store and buy shockingly bright green gloves in wholesale prices in large quantities and give them to his sexual conquests. And people that knew Robert and what he was up to would be on the lookout in Central Park or social events for women wearing bright green gloves, and then know that this woman had slept with Robert Roosevelt. The most scandalous behavior, and the one that really caused a permanent break with the rest of his family, was his relationship with Mistress Marion O'Shea. Most of his affairs were, brief, but Marion became a permanent fixture in his life. This is an image of her, the best one we have. We believe they connected when she was hired by the New York Citizen, and here's a front page of that newspaper. And this was published by Robert in one of his varied careers. He was part owner and the editor of the paper that was published from 1864 until 1873. He had an affair with Minnie and then set up a separate house with her down the street on East 20th Street and proceeded to have a whole second secret family with her. By 1869, she was already pregnant with their first child. And the cover story for them when they were together was that she was the widow of a soldier from Scotland named Robert F. Fortescue. It was only later that his double life was uncovered because of genealogical research done by descendants of Robert and Minnie. So Robert and Theodore were not talking, and then their separation became even more pronounced in 1873 when Theodore Sr. decided his neighborhood was too commercial because department stores were moving up Broadway. He moves uptown to 57th Street with another brother, James Alford, and Robert was not invited to join them. And this is their twin houses up on 57th Street, right near today's Plaza Hotel. So Lizzie died in 1887 after 37 years of marriage. And she's buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn with many other Roosevelts. So a year later, Robert married Minnie in England, No other members of his family were present. And by that point, his two sons and daughter with Lizzie were grown. They were Margaret Barnhill Roosevelt, John E. Roosevelt, who was a lawyer with his father's Wall Street firm of Roosevelt and Colby, and Robert Barnhill Roosevelt Jr., who was a lawyer who managed the family's large estate in Sayville out on Long Island, which was worth $3 million when the time he died. The three Fortescue children were also adults at this point when he gets married to Mitty. And he adopted Kenyon Fortescue, Granville Roland Fortescue, and Maud Fortescue. Kenyon became an attorney also with Roosevelt and Colby. And this is Granville. Had an interesting career on his own. He was a corporal in his first cousin Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War. Here you see TR in his uniform. Granville injured his foot in the famous charge of Kettle Hill in Cuba. Then he served as a first lieutenant in the 26th Volunteer Infantry during the 1899-1901 insurrection in the Philippines. Then he became a second lieutenant in the regular Army's 4th Cavalry. And then after graduating from the Army General Service and Staff College in 1904, he became a first lieutenant in the 10th United States Cavalry. And then Theodore Roosevelt appointed him as a military attaché at the White House. He resigned from the Army in 1906 and then served as a captain with the Cuban Royal Guard until resigning 3 years later to become a wars correspondent in Morocco for the London Standard. Then he reported in Europe during World War I for the London Daily Telegraph. And when the U.S. enters World War I in 1917, he served as a major with the field artillery and the American Expeditionary Force in France, where he was gassed during a German attack. He remains in the Army until 1928, retiring with the rank of major. This is what he looked like later. Leaving the Army turned out to be a big mistake because his personal life sort of crumbled. He married Grace Hubbard Bell, niece of the inventor Alexander Graham Bell, in 1910, and his personal life became increasingly messy because he basically refused to hold down a job. Ultimately, he died and is buried in Wellington National Cemetery here. You can see in 1952. He's actually the only member of the Roosevelt family to be buried in Arlington, which is kind of interesting. Most of them are in Greenwood and Brooklyn. Maud, meanwhile, married an English lawyer and moved to London. And then Mitty died in Atlantic City in 1902. So despite their overlapping interests, TR kept his distance from his uncle for at least 5 years after the death of his father in 1878, probably to respect his father's wishes that he stay away from Robert. But starting around 1900, there was an increasing flow of letters between TR and his uncle, and he even invited RBR to his 1905 inauguration, and then wrote a letter to his uncle from the White House saying, "Dear Uncle Rob, it was particularly pleasant having you here." So despite having the shared interest in conservation, politics, and public service, despite their proximity during TR's childhood, Theodore doesn't mention his uncle only once in his 1920 autobiography, and that has nothing to do with whatever influence he might have had on his nephew. The only reference concerns TR's aunt Anna Bullock, who was from Georgia, along with TR's mother, Mitty, and that would concern Brer Rabbit. TR wrote, "She knew all of the Brer Rabbit stories, and I was brought up on them. One of my uncles, Robert Roosevelt, was much struck with them and took them down from her dictation, publishing them in Harper's, where they fell flat. This was a good many years before a genius arose who in Uncle Remus made the stories immortal." But as time grew on, Nicholas, as I mentioned, in the 1950s, wrote about Robert And starting in the 1980s, the family basically decided that Robert should no longer be a black sheep. And this basically was a decision by his great-grandson, P. James Roosevelt, who was the head of the Oyster Bay branch at that point, who agreed to talk to me for that Newsday cover story in the magazine I showed you earlier. And he remarked, his lifestyle would not be considered extreme by today's standards. But as I mentioned, Nicholas in 1953 was the first relative to write about him, and he could tell that he loved Robert. He described him as, he said, vigorous, lusty, vital. He was an Elizabethan survival in the Victorian age, an unconventional member of a society and family in which the prudent mores of a provincial mercantile class viewed with displeasure any departure from the accepted norm. Our elders obviously had a serene confidence that the family was, or at least must appear to the world to be, above reproach. The few individuals whose excess of vitality took unconventional forms were ostracized. If ever their names were mentioned in the presence of the youngsters, the conversation was quickly turned, and our parents, when pressed, explained that every family had its black sheep, of whom the less said, the better. Uncle Rob cared little for the conventional and broadcast his thoughts to all who would read or listen to them. So it was basically P. James Roosevelt who decided to lift the curtain on Robert. And he said in my article, it has been said you may not like a Roosevelt, but you cannot find one that is boring. And Robert certainly was not boring. So there was one interest that Robert had, even at the time, did not embarrass his relatives and clearly inspired TR. That was his lifelong love of fishing and conservation of wildlife. With RBR, Nicholas Roosevelt wrote, quote, the restlessness inherited from his father, CVS Roosevelt, took the form of a passion for fishing and hunting. So Robert authored a half dozen books on those subjects. He loved the challenge of fishing, and he loved being out in the wilderness, even though he weighed 212 pounds on his 5'5" frame. But he liked to spread the joy of fishing. He would take people on fishing trips, turn it into a group activity. He would delight his guests by telling risque stories and coming up with gourmet recipes for the catch, which he would then prepare. But after spending all this time dealing with fishing and researching fish, he determined by the middle of the 19th century that marine life was being depleted by overfishing, industrial development, pollution, as well as constructions of dams that were blocking spawning runs. Nicholas said his common sense told him that the rapidity with which the country was growing and becoming urbanized would result in the extermination of the country's wildlife. His sense of the practical led him to fight for the first measures for conservation in this country. So Robert very vocally advocated for both voluntary and legally mandated conservation efforts in his books and articles and through his affiliation with various conservation groups. In his 1865 volume, Superior Fishing, or the striped bass, trout, and black bass of the northern states, quite a mouthful for the title. Here's an illustration from that book of him wearing a veil to keep the mosquitoes at bay. He has various recipes in a chapter entitled Cookery for Sportsmen, but then surprisingly in the middle of the book is a chapter called, quote, The Protection of Fish. And in that chapter, he sounds like a forerunner of Rachel Carson in her groundbreaking Silent Spring, when he writes that the supply of fish, quote, can be exhausted and in quality easily reduced is painfully apparent. Streams in the neighborhood of New York that formerly were alive with trout are now totally deserted. The shad that a few years ago swarmed up the Hudson in numbers incomputable have become scarce. So it has been and will be everywhere unless the people and the real sportsmen take the matter in hand. Robert, as usual, besides complaining, offered a remedy. he said, quote, "The first necessity is that proper and uniform enactments should be passed in every portion of our extensive nationality. Laws, however, are not as much to blame as the neglect of their enforcement. Enforce the laws thoroughly and discontinue unreasonable slaughter, and fish from their enormous fecundity must increase immensely. One injury should be punished by incarcerating the offender in prison. Mere pecuniary fines are insufficient punishment." So besides advocating, in 1864, he joined the New York Sportsman's Club, composed of 50 of the city's more prominent citizens. A decade later, it changed its name to the New York Association for the Protection of Game to better reflect its mission. Robert became vice president, and then in 1877, the president, and he then held that post until his death in 1906. The association became a model for wildlife protection groups around the country, and it lobbied successfully in Albany for conservation laws while also hiring detectives and filing lawsuits to prosecute violators of fish and game regulations. Nicholas Roosevelt wrote that at the time, quote, "It was unthinkable that a man should be restricted in the number of birds or animals he might kill on his own land, or the fish he might catch in his own streams. Only the occasional voice was raised against the wholesale slaughter of game and fowl on public lands in various parts of the country, and only a few ardent fishermen objected to the pollution of streams by the dumping of sawdust, sewage, and industrial refuse into them. Robert was one of them, and he objected publicly, frequently, and loudly." So he was an early advocate of pisciculture, as fish farming or mariculture was known then. And he was the president of the American Fish Culturist Association from 1874 to 1882. The family of a caretaker out on his Sayville estate on Long Island uncovered a trunk recently of Robert's papers, and also this stamp, which is a little hard to make out, but it says R.B. Roosevelt, President. So we're not sure if this was one of his banks or one of his conservation organizations, but it's a pretty cool thing to turn up. So his most prominent conservation role was with the New York State Fisheries Commission. He was one of the three founders, and you see a picture of them in 1886. He served without pay as a commissioner until 1888, when he was appointed minister to The Hague by President Grover Cleveland. When he came back to New York afterwards, he returned to the commission and became president in 1879. That commission ultimately evolved into the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, which bred shad and then whitefish, trout, and salmon at fish hatcheries around the state. Here's an illustration showing one of those hatcheries. The first one was in upstate Caledonia in 1870, followed by, in the 1880s, by others, including Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island. That one survives today as a nonprofit conservation organization. In 1879, the commission was given the additional task of regulating the shellfish industry, and in 1883, responsibility for game and fish protection force that had been created by the state legislature in 1880. In 1871, in his first year in Congress, he successfully introduced legislation to create a U.S. Commission of Fish and Fisheries, and later that year to authorize the agency to establish hatcheries on the Atlantic and Pacific coast to repopulate depleted species. When a foreign dignitary asked Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, who served from 1869 to 1877, about fishing in America, Fish directed him to Robert Roosevelt, saying he's the, quote, father of all the fishes. But fishing wasn't his only ecological interest. He promoted organic gardening well before it was popular. He also predicted that the last war would be between insects and men, and the insects would win. So along with conservation, involvement in politics remained a constant in his life. William Marcy, quote unquote, Boss Tweed, was already running Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine in New York City, when RBR upset his Republican members of his branch in Oyster Bay by deciding to run successfully for Congress as a Democrat in 1870. In the House, besides pushing conservation, he spoke out against the political ring that was running the District of Columbia, and the residents recognized his efforts by presenting him with a gold-headed cane. Here's one of RBR's bills presented in the House in 1872. He only served that one term from 1871 to 1873 before deciding he wasn't suited for life in Washington and came back to New York, at which point he helps take on Boss Tweed, whose corruption had become more and more visible. So even though he was elected with Tweed's help and help of Tammany Hall, he becomes a determined enemy of Boss Tweed. He and other Democrats held a big public meeting at Cooper Union in Greenwich Village in Manhattan, where they pushed for reform. Roosevelt was one of the speakers there who captivated the audience. And typically he was animated, and he suggested that anyone caught tampering with a ballot box should be shot on sight. He accused the Tweed ring of undermining liberty, and he helped organize the Committee of 70, which was the Citizens Review Reform group that helped force Tweed out in 1871. Back in the city, he also advocated for a paid city fire department to replace the competing volunteer organizations that weren't particularly efficient. And he also argued for replacing the out-of-date and inefficient sanitary board with a paid city health department. So he was pretty visible back in New York, but then he started to bow out of the public light because his nephew was becoming more and more visible in politics, and RBR did not want to embarrass him. So for that reason, in 1904, he refused the party's designation as a presidential elector at the convention, even though he had been a delegate at many previous conventions. He got back in the news again when he was elected as a new reform trustee for the Brooklyn Bridge construction project, serving from 1879 to 1881. There was a lot of corruption and misspent money, so Robert got involved to try to straighten that out. He also generated headlines, negative ones, when he called on the city government to create municipal jobs to prevent an uprising by the poor during a depression. He wrote, "Let us try some plan and convince the poor that we have blood of civilized men in our veins," he wrote. But the newspapers denounced him as a fool for suggesting it. When he wasn't crusading about stamping out corruption or saving wildlife, Robert would allow his dry sense of humor to emerge. He wrote a great letter to a newspaper when a academic complained that Theodore Roosevelt was mispronouncing his last name. And Robert wrote a letter saying it's pretty cheeky to tell somebody they don't know how to pronounce their own name. And then he spelled it out phonetically. He says there's 3 syllables, Roosevelt. And a lot of people still mispronounce it. But he also wrote several books that were fairly satirical. One was Progressive Petticoats, or Dressed to Death, the autobiography of a married man. Here's the cover of that book. It would not probably have gotten away with this in the modern sensibilities, but if you read it in context of the times, it is pretty funny. And he writes that the book is, quote, purely jocose and ironical, intended only as a harmless pleasantry, and nothing could be further from my intentions than to cast a slur on the sex, and that I am entirely satisfied, firmly convinced, and altogether persuaded that I have the best wife in the world. Then he goes on to dig himself deeper in the hole. He said, there is one peculiarity about the female character which seems to be universal with the sex. They are unable to appreciate a joke, especially when the joke bears a little against themselves. He goes on to say that, quote, women as a class have a mission. Our households are their natural happy hunting grounds. The health and happiness of the human race are in their keeping. My favorite book of his is called 5 Acres Too Much. And this was published in 1869, and he pokes fun at the then fashionable practice among the gentry of heading off to the country to establish what they hope would be self-sufficient farms. And he writes that he authored the book in response to, quote, a little volume called 10 Acres Enough, in which a charming and interesting account is given of the successful attempt of a Philadelphia mechanic to redeem a strip of exhausted land of 10 acres. So useful is the instruction it contains that no one should think of buying a farm, experimenting in rural life, or even reading this book without first perusing that one. To be sure, the author forgets occasionally some minor manners, such as clothing, food, and the like, leaving his family naked and unfed for several years. He then goes on to lay out the virtues of country living in his typical flowery marathon run-on sentences. Quote, the country, how beautiful it is to a man wearied with his cares of city life, who has pursued an exhausting profession for several years with vigorous energy, who has taken a hand in politics, attended caucuses and conventions, has a philanthropic turn of mind, and who moreover has abundant means. This, the last, is by no means least. The country, with its green leaves, its lovely flowers, its waving grass, its early vegetables, and its luscious fruits, is most attractive. All that is one sentence. So Robert discounts most of the areas around New York City as a potential paradise. He shows a particular disdain for Staten Island, which he writes, quote, is overrun by sauerkraut-eating, lager beer drinking Germans. That would also not be politically correct today. So he decides his, quote, Eden of a country village is Flushing in Queens County on Long Island. He said where he owned, quote, the 5 acres that this book is all about. So he decided to build a country home there and develop a farm. So the book is really funny. He devotes a chapter to like buying different animals, trying different crops. And here he's chasing a pig around for slaughter to generate some income. So my favorite chapter is about buying a cow. And he says, and again, this would not go over well with women today. He said, a cow is a model for a wife. She is gentle, good, and beautiful, and makes a fuss. So after his first year as a gentleman farmer, he wrote that he had, quote, shown how readily a person can pass from the profession of a lawyer to that of an agriculturalist. He noted that the weather had been exceptionally hot and dry, and my furniture had been badly damaged in being transported from the city to the country. So the profit, therefore, must be looked for not in merely vulgar material sense, but somewhat in the sensations, thoughts, and experiences that were included in the results of the year's labor. So he calculated that building the house and establishing the farm cost him almost $16,000, but that was somewhat offset by not spending $2,000 to travel to Newport or Saratoga for the summer. As a result, he said, quote, the profits of my first year were not large, but sufficient to induce me to continue the experiment. Our second year, he writes later in the book, was certainly a great advance upon the first, as the former might be said to have been rather a case for what the merchants call profit and loss, all loss and no profit, so far as actual production is concerned. The previous attempt had resulted in raising absolutely nothing, whereas our subsequent one had raised a great deal. We had much to show for it, although not always what we wanted. So he said his expenses in the second year were $76 and his proceeds were $277. Quote, taking all these things into account, I resolved to abandon the city to devote myself to agricultural pursuits, close quote. So he kept the farm, but he never left New York and the legal profession, that even though he says so in the book. So 1873, he leaves Congress. He purchased 215 acres on a lake out in Sayville on the south shore of Long Island in Suffolk County. He kept his 5 acres in Flushing. He also bought land in New Jersey and Texas. And on the Sayville property, he built a large wooden frame house that he called Lotus Lake. And here's a picture of the house, rather nice country house. Later, his 2 sons with Lizzie, Robert Jr. and John, built adjoining houses. And he loved fishing out there, hunting, sailing on the Great South Bay. He also loved the distance from his disapproving relatives up in Oyster Bay on the north shore of Long Island. Eventually, he even moved his secret Fortescue children out to the property. He had a way of getting headlines even on Long Island. They became infamous locally for racing buckboards pulled by teams of charging horses along the dusty local roads from the train station to their property when they came out to visit. And then it got worse in 1904 when the New York World reported on May 17th under a headline, Uncle of the President and his 2 sons burn up the Long Island roads. They had switched their buckboards for fancy racing cars, which were among the first on Long Island. And his arrival would be noted in the newspapers, and people would line up along the roads to watch RBR race his 2 sons out to Lotus Lake. And the reporter said that RBR, who is often referred to as Uncle Rob or Uncle Barnwell, was wearing, quote, the most approved automobile clothing and was driving himself with his long gray hair curling out from beneath his helmet. RBR, quote, acts as his own chauffeur, something his distinguished nephew has yet had the hardihood to attempt. Robert always finished first. I'm sure his sons let him win. So as much as he enjoyed the summers in Sayville and farming in Flushing, he never abandoned the city or politics, as evidenced by his election as to the Board of Aldermen in 1882. Then in 1888, President Grover Cleveland appoints him as minister to The Hague for 2 years. And then he was named treasurer of the Democratic National Committee in 1892. He never gave up on lecturing the public about what he thought should be going on with his public causes and public discourse. His last notoriety was suggesting changing the layout of Central Park, including removing the stone wall along Fifth Avenue to widen the roadway. As usual with his suggestions, it caused an uproar. So he wasn't particularly taking care of his health. He suffered from gout from his mid-20s on because he was overweight, and his attempts to drink lemon juice to cure it didn't quite work. So finally, he died out at Lotus Lake at age 76 on June 14th, 1906. And he was also the subject of a lot of satire in the media as well. So this is his gravestone. He's buried next to Lizzie in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. The house out in Sayville remained vacant after he died. It was vandalized until it was finally destroyed in an arson fire in 1958. John Ellis's house still stands as a museum house run by Suffolk County. So here's Robert again, about the time he served in the Netherlands. So Nicholas, who had met Robert only once at TR's inauguration in 1905, when he was 11 and RBR was about 80, wrote that, quote, Uncle Rob was a salty old bird and got more fun out of life than many of those whose silence about him failed to hide a prim distaste for the manner in which he insisted on living his own life in his own way instead of theirs. So what is Robert's legacy? Clearly, you can make the case that he influenced TR on conservation and serving in public life. And TR actually went to law school briefly and studied law with Robert in his office before deciding he'd rather get into politics rather than be a lawyer. So Tweed Roosevelt of Boston, who's a great grandson of TR and a former head of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, did a podcast on Robert, who we really enjoyed in 2021. And he said, quote, Robert was both a saint and a sinner. As a young man in his 20s, he was quite the ladies' man. His taste ran to showgirls and dancers, and they were no doubt bowled over by his status and money. Eventually, he settled down and got married, and this is when he started his good works. He was a very early conservationist and ecologist, and before the term was even invented. TR idolized him, and he became a role model for TR's later success in that area. So I'm going to stop here, and we'll see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was such an enlightening presentation. I learned so much about someone who I thought I knew a fair amount about, and so many fun stories. All right, so like Bill mentioned, this is the Q&A section. So if you'd like to post a question in the chat, please do so now. But I will take host privilege and ask one of my own first. So Bill, I was wondering what initially drew you to RBR's story? What made you think like there is more to tell here? Like someone needs to cover RBR in more depth.
Well, it all started back in 1985. I was already covering Oyster Bay and the Roosevelt family fairly extensively. And John Gable, who was then the director of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, said, "I got a great story for you." And he told me the quick summary of Robert's life, and put me in touch with the history chair at St. John's University who had been researching Robert for 20 years. So I hooked up with him, and the result is that magazine story. I never stopped thinking about Robert because he was just so interesting. At one point, I actually had a book contract to do a whole biography of him with the history professor. But what's fascinating about Robert was, as publicly as he is, at one point, there's 10 years where he doesn't show up in the public record. So he's just totally off the radar. My guess is this is when TR was ascending into politics, and Robert basically just stayed out of the limelight, probably just practicing law. But the history professor said, we can't do a biography without knowing what he was doing for 10 years. So the project fell apart. But I didn't give up. I have a chapter in the book about Robert, and people keep saying, why don't you turn him into a full book? So, it could still happen.
Yes, I would encourage you to do so. And I think a lost period in your subject's life is, if nothing, a great mystery to chase.
Yeah. But I was okay with it, just explaining it as I just did. But he said, as an academic, I can't have a hole in the story. So the project died.
That sounds like an academic.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question. I will also read out loud. TR famously visited RBR at Sayville during his presidency. Are there any known visits by TR with RBR as a youth or a young man that might show his influence on TR's conservation ethic?
TR and RBR never wrote about TR coming over there as a child. I mean, it would be obvious that they would go next door to see their uncle, who's outgoing and gregarious, plus all the animals. TR famously, as president, made it overnight ride through the rain with his cousins up in Oyster Bay to go visit John Ellis. And this is after RBR died. So we don't know of any visits by TR to Robert in Sayville, but he did visit John Ellis, and that he eluded the Secret Service and the press corps by doing this, and rode through the rain overnight, had breakfast with his nephew, and then rode back to Oyster Bay, and generated a lot of unhappiness among the press and the Secret Service.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Okay, and now for one that's completely different. We're kind of jumping around here. Elizabeth Barber on Facebook asks, did his introduction of the European starlings in Central Park as a member of the New York City Bird Conservation Committee come up in your research?
It did not. It's not in. Um, I didn't see it. I didn't read every word of the fishing book because it was more
Mhm.
detail than I would have room to deal with. But I haven't come across that.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating though, Elizabeth. All right, and then another question. What is your favorite RBR anecdote?
Um, Probably the green gloves. I just think that's priceless. The the fact that he would trumpet his sexual encounters, I just think is just sums up his personality so well.
Do you know why green?
They were cheap. Uh,
Um, mhm.
he could no, most people were not buying them because they were gaudy and green and pretty ugly. So he would go to A.T. Stewart's and they would just sell him boxes of them at wholesale prices to get rid of them. But
Wow.
I think he also liked the fact that they were so gaudy that they would stand out. So people that knew him and knew what he was doing could spot these women very easily. So I think it was a combination of being ostentatious and he could get them cheap.
Well, yes, it's funny how the tides turn on colors because now green is like the hot, everyone wants to paint their kitchen green.
Right.
But it
But
used
they
to
were
be.
described as gaudy, so it
Yeah.
was probably a pretty outrageous color.
Hmm. All right. And now, are there any specific ideas in Theodore Roosevelt's conservation ethic that come to mind as being clearly connected to RBR?
Um, I think everything TR did as a conservationist, creating the national parks, saving the elk herd out west. Um, it all goes back to Robert. I mean, TR was interested from childhood in animals. Because he was a sickly child with asthma. He spent a lot of time at home reading books, and uh, there's a famous story that he was sent out by his mother to pick up something at the market for dinner, and comes across a dead seal in front of a fish market.
Mhm.
Uh, he goes back every day to measure the seal, ask the fishmonger questions, eventually persuades the fishmonger to give him the skull when the thing had sort of wasted away. And he says with that, he started the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. By the time he was 11, he had 1,000 uh, uh, artifacts in this museum and live and dead taxidermy things, and the skull. Uh, and he had live mice, live snakes, which would sometimes show up on the dinner table. Uh, but all this. I mean, so he's interested in natural history, uh, but saving natural history really, I'm sure it just came from Robert, because it's not something if you're making taxidermy and collecting specimens, that doesn't necessarily lead to trying to save wildlife.
Yes, absolutely. And that makes me think of a connection to the institution. In our core exhibit, we are going to have an interactive representation of the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History that will feature all of the kind of little critters that TR taxidermied and studied in his childhood. So that should be a really fun kind of tie in to this story here. All right, we have another. Oh, and Elizabeth is mentioning green is the historic color of Ladiesville repute. I had forgotten about that. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay. How have the more controversial aspects of RBR's life influenced the way historians interpret or choose not to interpret his contributions to conservation?
They're really separate. I mean, he was a groundbreaking conservationist in everything he did, and he was celebrated for that. It was his personal life that caused the family to sort of distance themselves, but um, he was very prominent in the field, as I gave you all his titles and involvement.
Mm-hmm.
So people then and now are able to separate two pieces of him. His public life, running the newspaper, being in Congress, and all that stuff, and the conservation. Um, was he was was accepted at the time. So It's just the moral part was more of an issue for his family, I'm sure, and others in in the elite society. But so they might not want to socialize with him, but they would support him for his causes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sounds great. And kind of hearkening back to our conversation about the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History, was Robert also a collector of wildlife?
I don't believe so. I've never seen any reference to him. He liked to fish. He would cook the fish. I never seen any reference to taxidermy or anything. His wife Lizzie had the live animals, but I've never seen any reference. He never refers to collecting specimens like TR did.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this might be another way in which TR is an unusual Roosevelt. All right, and then I think we have one last kind of fun question here, which is a callback to your section where you talked about RBR's defense of TR's pronunciation of his own name. So, what's the most egregious mispronunciation of Roosevelt you've ever encountered?
There are people that say Roosevelt,
Mm-hmm.
which is not even close. Most people say Roosevelt as 2 syllables, which I did also until I came across Robert's letter to the editor, where he chastised this academic for criticizing TR. But it's Roosevelt, 3 syllables, and it means field of roses in Dutch, which Robert explained in the article.
Oh, I guess that would really I feel like I still wouldn't know how to pronounce it after that, but my grandparents did say Roosevelt.
Yeah.
So yeah,
a lot of that comes from FDR was frequently called Roosevelt. And so I think people picked it up there, but his name would also be Roosevelt. But you hear a lot of people talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So.
Yes, yeah, I've definitely heard it styled that way. Okay, so thank you so much, Bill, for answering all of these wild and varied questions, as varied as the man that they are asking about. So if people want to see more about your work, what should they check out?
Okay, I have a website, billbleyer.com, pretty simple. You can see summaries. You can see my full autobiography. You can see summaries of all my books. You can see, I have 13 lectures that I give on those books. And if you want to see where I'm giving them, you can go to the events page. Some of them, like tonight, are online if you're not in the New York area. You can also order signed and autographed inscribed copies of my books if you're so interested.
Wonderful. I know I'll be checking that out. Thank you very much, Bill, for sharing this story with our audience. This session will be recorded, so if you know of anyone who would be interested but couldn't join us tonight, please feel free to share the link with them. If you liked this virtual program, check out our future offerings at trlibrary.com or consider buying a ticket to visit us in person at trlibrary.com/tickets. Grand opening is in 96 days. I checked today, and we are feeling that it is in the double digits. So please consider coming to visit us in person, and thank you for joining us tonight. Have a good night, everyone.